What happens when a nation surrounded by uncertainty decides to flood its own skies with weapons, 5,000 of them aimed at anything that dares to cross its borders? The scene unfolding over Venezuela in 2025 feels less like a defensive posture and more like the opening frame of a crisis spiraling towards something no one can fully predict. Before dawn, radar stations light up the horizon, and along jungle ridgelines, desert flats, and coastal cliffs, Venezuelan soldiers stand watch beside rows of shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, compact, portable, and deadly to anything flying low and slow. It is an image engineered to project strength, but in reality, it reveals a government preparing for the possibility that the next move might come not from diplomacy, but from the sky. The announcement stunned the region. 5,000 anti-aircraft missiles deployed to guarantee peace. That phrase, simple, vague, and ominous, immediately ignited a debate among analysts. What does guarantee peace mean when the systems involved are designed not for political messaging, but for destroying aircraft at altitudes where helicopters, drones, and attack jets operate? These weapons, typically reaching up to 10,000 or even 12,000 feet, create a lethal dome over the country's most sensitive terrain. They do not deter by symbolic presence. They deter by the mathematical certainty that anything entering that envelope could fall from the sky in flames. But the deeper tension comes from the unanswered question: could these weapons threaten something as massive, something as iconic as a US B-52 bomber? Military analysts across Washington, Bogota, and Brasilia argue that while a lone missile would struggle to bring down a high-altitude strategic bomber saturation fire from dozens of launchers, especially during low-altitude operations, changes the equation, and that debate alone raises the temperature of the crisis. Inside Venezuela, the government calls the mobilization purely defensive. Readiness levels have been raised across the Army, National Guard, and militia forces. Roadblocks appear along key routes. Supply convoys move under cover of night. At the same time, the US warns that ground operations may begin soon, a phrase that lands like a thunderclap across the hemisphere. According to American officials, intelligence assets already know where the targets are, the routes they use, and how to stop them. That confidence is not performative, it is preparatory. Above all, the tension now shifts from capability to intent. The US has the means to strike anywhere, from stealth jets sweeping in unseen to naval missiles launched beyond Venezuela's defensive range. Venezuela, meanwhile, positions itself like a fortress expecting a siege, distributing mobile launch teams across rugged terrain where US forces cannot easily track or eliminate them. And so the stage forms quietly, ominously, inevitably between a superpower projecting overwhelming force and a regional government betting everything on the belief that saturating the skies may keep American firepower at bay. Yet beneath every calculation lies a more haunting uncertainty. Are these missiles truly meant to prevent conflict, or do they mark the moment the conflict became unavoidable? The question lingers heavy and unanswered as the world watches a nation ring itself with weapons, while a superpower inches closer to a decision that could reshape the hemisphere. And the skies above Venezuela, crowded with sensors, radars, and missile silhouettes, begin to look less like a deterrent and more like a warning flare. As Venezuela hardens its air defenses and saturates its territory with thousands of anti-aircraft missiles, Washington enters a mode that US officials rarely acknowledge publicly, but always prepare for a calculation of consequences. It is the point where diplomacy becomes overshadowed by strategy, where warnings transform into timelines, and where the Oval Office under President Donald Trump in 2025 must decide whether deterrence alone can contain a government signaling that it is ready to confront the world's most powerful military. In closed-door briefings, US commanders outline scenarios not in abstract probabilities, but in concrete sequences, what the first hour would look like, the first night, and the first 3 days of a campaign that could change the geopolitical map of the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's announcement of 5,000 missile systems intensified this urgency. These are not long-range interceptors capable of contesting high-altitude US bombers. They are tactical, low-altitude killers designed for helicopters, drones, and strike aircraft operating in the envelope, where the US often relies on speed and precision. If fired en masse, they could force American pilots to adjust their altitude, their approach vectors, or their willingness to enter Venezuelan airspace at all. That single adjustment has enormous strategic consequences. It alters strike timelines, complicates rescue operations, and potentially endangers surveillance missions meant to guide US targeting. This is why senior Pentagon planners now speak quietly but clearly about dominance, not merely deterrence. Washington cannot allow a regional missile stockpile to dictate where and how the US projects power. before the Trump administration already intent on re-establishing strong American posture abroad, allowing Venezuela to close its skies would carry global implications. Rivals from Beijing to Tehran would interpret hesitation as weakness. Allies across Latin America, already nervous about the growing instability, would question America's reliability. And within the United States, political pressure mounts for decisive action before the crisis metastasizes into something beyond control. Thus, in situation rooms and military theaters, a familiar logic takes shape. If the US moves, it must strike fast, early, and overwhelmingly. This is the internal calculus behind rising warnings from Washington. Officials insist that they know where the targets are, know the routes they use, and know how to stop them, language that makes clear the US is not scrambling, it is preparing. The message is aimed not at the American public, but at Caracas. And yet the Venezuelan government, emboldened by its missile posture and domestic narrative of resistance, pushes forward as if convinced that a fortified sky can neutralize American power. Meanwhile, intelligence flights continue near Venezuelan borders, naval vessels reposition in the Caribbean, long-range bombers conduct what US officials call training runs, though their timing and proximity leave little ambiguity about their purpose. Each of these movements is designed to send a signal the US military is no longer observing the crisis it is staging for it. Washington's calculus now centers on a delicate balance. Strike too early and the region plunges into chaos. Strike too late and Venezuelan forces may entrench deeper, making any operation costlier. But do nothing and the credibility of American security commitments erodes. And so the question sharpens as the missiles pile up in Venezuela and the warships gather offshore. Is America preparing to prevent a conflict or to end one before it begins? Before any ground force moves, before an amphibious landing, before a single US Marine steps onto Venezuelan soil, the true opening of a modern conflict would begin in silence high above the Caribbean, where machines engineered for invisibility glide through the night. If war erupts, analysts agree the first blow will be airborne, instantaneous, and devastating. And for Venezuela, whose leadership believes its 5,000 anti-aircraft missiles can deny American access, the moment of truth would arrive within minutes. What happens when a nation built on layered defenses suddenly faces platforms designed to erase those defenses before they even fire? That is the question shaping every calculation in Caracas. In the opening phase, the US would avoid the altitude where Venezuelan missiles are most effective. The plan would begin at 50,000 feet, far beyond the reach of man-portable launchers. From there, F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning IIs would slip across the border, invisible to most radar systems, targeting the backbone of Venezuela's surveillance network, the radar's power nodes, relay towers, and air defense command centers that allow those missiles to function as more than isolated launch tubes. Once those systems go dark, the missiles become blind weapons, dangerous up close, but strategically irrelevant. What follows next is not explosive spectacle, but coordinated paralysis. Electronic warfare aircraft jam military frequencies. Cyber units disrupt communication flows across Venezuelan bases. Unmanned drones saturate the airspace mapping launch sites, troop movements, and potential safe corridors. In war rooms across the United States, analysts study these feeds in real time, adjusting flight plans, selecting targets, and preparing the second wave. All of this unfolds before Venezuela fires a single shot. Then the strike platforms arrive. B-1 Lancers, B-2 Spirits, and B-52 Stratofortresses, each carrying precision-guided munitions capable of hitting hardened bunkers from dozens of miles away, release their payloads long before entering Venezuelan airspace. This is the moment military planners call dislocation, when a country realizes that its defensive perimeter is no longer a perimeter at all. Bases go dark, runways crack, communication hubs collapse. Venezuelan commanders already under pressure must decide whether to deploy their missiles in panic or conserve them for a battle that may never materialize. The irony is brutal. The systems Venezuela relies on to guarantee peace become irrelevant once their ability to track and engage targets is severed. Low-flying US aircraft, those most at risk, simply do not appear. American pilots stay high, stay fast, or remain far offshore, launching standoff weapons that glide toward their targets from beyond Venezuelan reach. The US avoids the missile envelope entirely, turning Venezuela's massive arsenal into a static display of power with no aircraft to shoot down. And yet the psychological toll is immense. When radars fail, when bases lose power, when commanders cannot coordinate, the sense of control evaporates. Militaries do not collapse from firepower alone, they collapse from blindness. Across the region, observers draw comparisons to early strikes in Ukraine, precision shadow warfare between Israel and Iran, and the constant tailing conflict between the US and China over contested airspace. The pattern is unmistakable. In modern war, the first blow is not meant to destroy the enemy's weapons, it is meant to destroy the enemy's ability to understand the battlefield. And once that ability is gone, the missiles, the battalions, even the coastline itself become vulnerable. Now the question stands, if the air war begins, how long could Venezuela keep control of its own sky minutes, hours, or not at all? If an air campaign marks the first rupture in Venezuela's defenses, the real strain emerges when pressure begins arriving from every direction at once. Modern American warfare is not linear. It does not advance front by front. Instead, it collapses an adversary's structure through simultaneous shocks: air, sea, cyber, electronic, and covert. The United States has rehearsed this method for decades, refining it in conflicts from the Middle East to the Pacific. But in 2025, with a missile-saturated Venezuela standing defiant and President Trump vowing to restore strategic stability in the hemisphere, the stakes rise far beyond a regional confrontation. They reverberate through global rivalries already simmering across 3 continents. While stealth jets blind the radars and bombers strike from offshore, the US Navy begins the next movement. Destroyers and cruisers positioned beyond the horizon launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, threading across coastal terrain to hit ammunition depots, naval piers, and command posts. Carrier air wings operating from decks far outside the range of Venezuelan missiles disperse into attack routes that fragment the defenders' attention. The result is a form of strategic suffocation every time Venezuela shifts to reinforce one front, another collapses. The military term is overmatch, but in practice it feels like drowning. At the same time, special operations forces enter the theater. They do not seize territory, they seize momentum. Deployment platforms like the MV Ocean Trader, designed for covert insertion, enable Navy SEALs and other elite units to strike high-value targets, communications hubs, leadership compounds, intelligence sites before slipping back into the shadows. These missions are not dramatized assaults, but precision cuts designed to unravel Venezuela's ability to coordinate its vast militia networks and missile units. Each successful strike accelerates the collapse of centralized control. Then comes the electronic front. Cyber units disrupt encrypted channels used by Venezuelan commanders, injecting confusion into logistics lines. Jamming aircraft scramble GPS signals, destabilizing the very systems the missile units depend on. Venezuela might have thousands of launchers, but without coordination, they become isolated pockets of firepower, deadly but directionless. And in modern warfare, a weapon without guidance becomes less a shield and more a desperate last resort. Observers across the world recognize the pattern. They saw it when Ukrainian drone swarms blinded Russian logistics, when Israel neutralized Iranian infrastructure in minutes, when US and Chinese vessels shadow each other in contested waters, each prepared to jam, blind, and disable before firing the first shot. The Venezuelan crisis now becomes another node in this emerging doctrine. Victory is achieved not by overwhelming an enemy's weapons, but by overwhelming an enemy's systems. Meanwhile, regional governments from Colombia to Brazil brace for spillover. Intelligence agencies warn of militia mobilizations near borders. Refugee routes begin forming long before the first major strike. Oil markets jitter. European allies watch closely, fearing that a precedent set in the Americas could echo across Eastern Europe. In Beijing, planners analyze every move the US makes, studying how Washington handles a missile-saturated adversary without triggering a protracted occupation. Through it all, Caracas hopes that its 5,000 missiles provide immunity, but the truth emerging from every theater of modern conflict is stark static defenses collapse under multi-directional pressure. It is not firepower that breaks them, it is tempo. Now a chilling question emerges: if Venezuela is forced to defend every front at once, how long before the fabric holding its military together begins to tear? Amid the satellite maps, missile inventories, and war game scenarios, the crisis in Venezuela carries a weight that no briefing slide can capture. The lives caught beneath the machinery of great power confrontation. In towns along the Orinoco River, in the barrios of Caracas, on coastal villages facing the Caribbean, Venezuelans wake each morning not knowing whether the sky above them will remain quiet or erupt into a theater of fire. As the government disperses its 5,000 anti-aircraft missiles across rugged terrain, the human dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Every launcher placed near a settlement becomes more than a tactical position. It becomes a symbol of how war chooses bystanders long before soldiers. The Venezuelan military, stretched thin after years of economic hardship, relies heavily on militias and reserve forces. Many of these fighters are not seasoned professionals, but civilians handed uniforms and weapons told that the homeland now depends on them. Some stand watch at makeshift checkpoints, others operate mobile missile teams, hidden among forests or abandoned buildings. The question haunting them isn't merely whether they can stop US aircraft, it's whether they understand the scale of the force approaching. For them, the idea of facing F-22's cruise missiles and naval firepower is not strategic theory, it is fear disguised as duty. At the same time, coastal communities feel the tension most acutely. These are the places where a US Marine landing, if ordered, would unfold in minutes. Residents have watched the sea for years as a source of food and trade. Now they watch it as a frontier of uncertainty. Fishing boats shuttle quietly along the shoreline, radios tuned to military broadcasts, while rumors spread faster than official statements, rumors of US amphibious vehicles, of naval buildup, of sudden evacuations. And though nothing has happened yet, the psychological toll is its own kind of strike. When people begin storing water, pulling children from schools, or sealing windows with tape, the war has already begun emotionally, if not militarily. Families across Venezuela now live with the contradiction of state messaging and lived reality. Leaders tell them the missile shield guarantees peace, but the presence of thousands of launchers signals the opposite: preparation for violence. Parents know that once the skies fill with aircraft, no neighborhood is truly safe. A precision strike meant for a military installation could still devastate nearby homes. Infrastructure failures, power outages, water shortages, collapsed communications would follow within hours of major strikes, leaving the most vulnerable trapped inside an emergency with no clear escape route. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations quietly prepare contingency plans. Aid groups in Colombia anticipate refugee flows. Brazilian units near Roraima rehearse border security drills. International observers warn that even a short conflict could displace hundreds of thousands. The map of potential humanitarian corridors grows more complex with every passing day. In crisis simulations, the overlap of military and civilian zones is nearly total, suggesting that any assault, even a precise one, will disrupt far more than military targets. And then there are the Venezuelan soldiers themselves. Many are young conscripts who joined for a salary rather than ideology. They stand in sandbagged positions, gripping launch tubes, rehearsing firing drills, fully aware that the first wave of US strikes will likely target their very locations. For them, bravery and helplessness blend into a single emotion: the knowledge that even perfect aim cannot stop what they are being asked to face. In times like these, nations speak of strategy, deterrence, and geopolitical balance. But on the ground, the story is simpler and far more tragic: families trying to survive decisions made far above them, soldiers preparing for battles they cannot win, and civilians hoping the storm passes without touching their doors. And as this crisis deepens, another question rises heavy and unavoidable in a conflict defined by missiles and power: who bears the true cost when the first strike finally falls? As the crisis enters its most volatile stage, the Caribbean becomes a chessboard of steel and intention. US destroyers trace slow arcs just beyond Venezuelan waters, their radar masts glowing against the night. Surveillance drones sweep the coastline, mapping every bunker, every missile nest, every convoy moving under cover of darkness. Farther out, an aircraft carrier strike group pivots into position, its presence unmistakable, its purpose unspoken, and on quiet frequencies known only to a few special operations platforms lurk, waiting for an order that could redraw the balance of power in minutes. For the Trump administration, this is no longer a diplomatic standoff. It is a test of American prestige, credibility, and global leadership at a moment when rivals are watching with forensic intensity. Venezuela, meanwhile, projects defiance. State media broadcast images of missile units training in the mountains. Columns of militia fighters march through city plazas. The narrative is clear: the nation will resist and the missile shield will protect it. But beneath the surface, the stress fractures widen. Fuel shortages strain logistics. Communication blackouts ripple through remote bases. Commanders struggle to maintain cohesion across a decentralized defensive grid. A force armed with 5,000 missiles is formidable, but a force struggling to coordinate under pressure risks collapsing from within long before the first American strike. In Washington, strategists consider not only the battlefield, but the message. The world remembers the US withdrawals of recent years, the political divisions, the debates over American resolve. Now, with Russian operations still grinding in Ukraine, with Beijing pushing boundaries in the South China Sea, and with Iran probing Israel's thresholds, the Venezuelan crisis becomes more than a regional flashpoint. It becomes a stage on which American power is measured. If the US hesitates, adversaries may sense opportunity. If it strikes too aggressively, allies fear escalation that could ripple far beyond Latin America. The balance between action and restraint hangs by a thread. Thus, the question facing US leadership is far more complex than how to disable missile batteries or secure beachheads. It is a question about the architecture of global order. Can America demonstrate overwhelming capability without igniting a conflict that destabilizes an entire region? Can it enforce red lines without fueling the arguments of rival powers who already portray the United States as heavy-handed? And perhaps most critically, where does deterrence end and where does overreach begin? Inside Venezuela, civilians feel this ambiguity more sharply than any strategist. Night after night, they watch the skies for bombers, the coast for ships, the roads for militia movements. Some believe the US will strike. Others insist it is a bluff. But all sense the same truth. The country stands on a knife's edge, and every day without an explosion feels like borrowed time. The atmosphere is thick with anticipation, tense, electric, unsustainable. Meanwhile, global markets fluctuate, diplomats negotiate emergency corridors, analysts debate whether this confrontation could become a template for future US interventions or a cautionary tale about the limits of modern deterrence. And in the silence between official statements, one understands that even the smallest miscalculation could ignite something far larger than either side intends. Now the hemisphere watches two forces edging toward a point where choices become irreversible. Venezuela clings to the belief that its missiles can hold the line. The United States prepares for the moment those missiles no longer matter. And as warships glide into position and radars hum across the darkened coastline, the world confronts a question heavy with consequence. Is this the final moment before diplomacy returns, or the last calm before the storm breaks? The Venezuela-US crisis of 2025 escalates with Caracas' announcement that it has deployed 5,000 anti-aircraft missiles, prompting fears that the region is moving closer to open conflict. While Venezuela frames the buildup as a defensive guarantee of peace, analysts warn that the systems, though lethal at low altitudes, are unlikely to deter a full-scale American operation. Washington, under President Donald Trump, prepares a spectrum of response options, emphasizing overwhelming air dominance and multi-front pressure designed to blind and disable Venezuela's defenses before they can meaningfully respond. A potential US campaign would combine stealth aircraft, long-range bombers, naval missile strikes, cyber operations, and special forces insertions, mirroring patterns seen in Ukraine, Israel-Iran exchanges, and US-China competition. As military tensions rise, civilians in Venezuela face growing fear, infrastructure strain, and the possibility of rapid humanitarian displacement. Meanwhile, global powers watch closely, interpreting the crisis as a test of American resolve and credibility. Ultimately, the confrontation becomes a struggle not only over territory or weapons, but over geopolitical prestige and the delicate balance between deterrence and escalation. And as forces on both sides tighten their posture, the world is left to wonder whether diplomacy can return or whether the first strike is already inevitable.